All right, everybody, we're going live in 3, 2, 1. Happy Sunday, everybody. I don't even know if that's a greeting. No idea why I just said that, but there we go. Happy Sunday. Welcome to Mix It Up with ML, episode number 7. And you guys have probably heard me say I'm excited for every episode, but I'm very excited for this episode because this is actually our first 23-year-old, I guess, and non-fresh out of undergrad person.
Yeah,
And
bringing the geriatric people came all the way out of the nursing home for this very special episode of Mix It Up with ML.
I know. I'm setting myself up for failure there. Ma'am Tawa is not that old. She's just older than me. And we're very excited to have my thesis mentor, Elisabeth Tawa, who I often refer to as Ma'am Tawa. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. A big fan of the pod.
Yes. Thank you so much. So, you know the drill. We like to start off the podcast with a little bit of context for the listeners for our relationship. So please feel free to go ahead and explain that.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this prior because I was like, I know I'm going to have to talk about this on the podcast. And it's actually a pretty funny story of how Michael and I became friends. So I think it's like you had probably been in our labs. Like I'm a grad student at Princeton, was in the Gould lab, switched, which is another thing. But originally met Michael. You were like doing your thesis work, like joined the lab junior year. And I feel like you'd probably been in the lab for like about an entire semester, but I feel like we'd like never spoken to each other or anything.
Which is weird, right? It's very weird.
But yeah, I think it was like the first time we like really had a good solid conversation was like I was in the lab one day and like you were in the corner like doing something like some immuno thing or something. And I think like we had basically like Michael and I had this common experience of like almost going to Johns Hopkins to play our respective sports. And we talked like, I don't even know how it came up, just like something I said something about Hopkins. I think it was maybe you were like wearing your shirt, like the basketball shirt or something.
Okay. Sounds right.
Somehow it came up and then we learned that. And I was like, we both had like this very similar experience. And I was like, oh, like that's pretty cool. But I feel like, yeah, that was like the first time we'd ever really talked in lab. And then flash forward like a few months, you ended up like coming to like work with me on my project. I was working on this project looking at like physical exercise and structural plasticity in the brain, relating to anxiety regulation. And Michael wanted to come work with me. And then, yeah, like we made a senior thesis together.
Woo!
And I made a very good friend in the process.
Oh, you're too kind.
Like,
Thank you.
I'm not a conventional PhD student. I'm a cool PhD student. Not really. I feel like it's like us, like the grad students. Like, I feel like I'm probably was secretly like, oh, he probably thinks I'm just like super nerdy. And like, why would he like even want to talk to me? Like all the undergrads probably think we're so weird and nerdy.
Right.
But I'm like, in reality, they probably don't even like really think about us. Like everyone's so like up in their own stuff and like stressed and yeah. Anyway, that's how we met in the lab.
Absolutely. That's a great point. I forgot, that we had barely even talked when I was working on my junior paper.
Yeah, it's pretty funny.
And it's interesting, right? Because I remember like I was very interested in the autism stuff that I did for my JP, but then I was also very interested in the stuff that I did for the senior thesis, which was like the physical exercise work. I was interested in that my junior year, but I never knew it was you who worked on it, which is so weird for the whole time I was in the lab, So
yeah, because I think there were like there were like a couple of people like before me who had like done some stuff like related to running, but yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, thank you for giving the context there, Ma'am Tawa. And yeah, I figured we could jump right in. We could start first with the grad school stuff, like the Princeton PhD. And so, yeah. Listeners know that you were getting your PhD in neuroscience at Princeton. And so that's how we met in the lab. So we were doing work together. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about your experience with that PhD and just your reflections. And just because for context, now you're doing your master's in public health right now. And then you're going to go back and finish the PhD at Princeton.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. So just like I'd love for listeners, maybe there's some, if anybody's listening, who are considering grad school and stuff like that. So it's always helpful to get, the wisdom from people like yourself who have been through it.
Yeah. So like I said, before we started recording, I could talk about this a lot.
Right.
But I think, like the big thing that I think I've realized throughout the process of being a grad student is like, So just like for context, like I did my undergrad at Swarthmore, which is like a small liberal arts school. Like we have like a
SWAT.
very large, yeah, adult jokes about SWAT. It's also, we're also really weird. But that aside, like the type of undergrad school that I went to is like very much like the type of school that like primes people for an academic path forward. So it's like a very, very large proportion of like graduating students like pursue doctoral study, like whether that be like PhDs or like medical school or law school, but like it is like a lot of PhDs, like a lot of children of professors whose kids, you know, like are expected to kind of like go forward in academia as well. So I think it's like, for me, having gone to Swarthmore, like there's kind of like this pressure almost of kind of like, oh, well, like you're obviously going to get a PhD after this, right? Like, and more so than like at other universities, like that aren't small liberal arts colleges, where I feel like there's like, you're more aware maybe of like what other potential like career paths or like things you have available to you are. Not that I'm like trying to like blame Swarthmore, like it's like,
Yeah.
or like blame, like, you know, like I think like me getting the PhD is like a very, it's been really good for me, I think, in a lot of ways. But just like that being said, I felt like undergrad, like I didn't have a whole lot of exposure, I feel like, to like other things that were available to me or like other paths I could have gone down. So I like after undergrad, this is like very like 6,000 foot view. But I
It's
did a
helpful. It's good.
post-bac at NIH. So yeah, applied to like some fellowships and jobs, like was planning on probably doing a PhD. Because that also affected, like I also could have had like a 5th year to run, but like that's kind of like tangential. Like me like wanting to do a PhD kind of like influenced like those decisions as well. Like I was like, I just want to like do a post-bac fellowship, kind of like explore my interests a little bit further. Because I think it was also like I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. Like I was a neuroscience major in undergrad,
Right.
but I wasn't sure like if my interests were better suited for like neuroscience versus clinical psych versus, I mean, like I never thought about going to med school. Like I wasn't a pre-med, but just kind of like trying to like
Thank God.
explore. And then like I ended up being interested in public health, which is like, again, there's like a lot of overlap between these various fields. But I wasn't sure like exactly what I wanted to do. Like I felt like I did a little bit of research in undergrad, but it was kind of like all over the place. Anyway, so went to NIH, was really the first time I was exposed to people who worked in public health. So I was kind of like, did like a ton of informational interviews, like trying to figure out, like, I was like, well, I like neuro and, you know, like things that are like related to psychiatry research, like that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
Um, but I was also like, I had never like even heard of like public health, like, cause again, like at my undergrad school, like we didn't have that at all. So I was like, did a lot of informational interviews, talked to a lot of people, and I was like trying to make this big decision. I felt like when I was like applying to grad school in 2016 between
Right.
like trying to figure out like whether a PhD still made sense for me and also trying to figure out like, okay, like should I apply to public health programs or neuro? Um, and then at the end of the day, like decided I was like, no, like I think I'm more cut out for neuroscience. And like I do still kind of feel that way, I think,
Mhm.
after all of this. But yeah, like the MPH was like something that like had been in my mind, like, yeah, as
Right.
long ago as like 2016 or so. So I started graduate school, and yeah, coming to Princeton, it was a bit shocking, bit of a shock to the system, which isn't to say like by no means was like Swarthmore a breeze, right? Like I'm like, no, like I
No.
feel like I still had to like I like did the honors program, like, you know, like it's thought to be like pretty rigorous, but our like first year curriculum was insane, like kind of like balancing the coursework with also trying to like do some like rotation work and just like a lot of things, like you're kind of like in and out of the lab for like certain classes and like learning all sorts of things. I didn't have like as much of the quantitative background as some of my classmates, because like some of my cohort mates were like Stanford computer science, like Stanford
Yeah.
applied math. So I felt like that was like a really big challenge I had to surmount. So like even though like I felt like in some ways like Swarthmore like in my post-bac like prepared me really well, it
Mm.
was like at first it was, yeah, it was like really overwhelming. I was working like close to like 80 hours a week regularly, like every week. And then I think like second semester it got a little bit better. And then once I was in the lab, it was like a little bit calmer. But I think it's like I have had like a lot of moments like throughout like my first 3 years where I was like, do I actually want to do this?
Mm.
And also like for me, like when I applied to graduate school, like I kind of went in not thinking I wanted an academic career, which is like very unusual. Like most people like go into a PhD program like I want to like go into
Be a
academia
professor
in this
and
field.
yeah.
Yeah, but it was like some of the people who I had like talked to previously when I was trying to make my decision whether to apply or not were like, oh, well, like a PhD like is still really useful for like, certain government jobs, like you can do industry research, like, like there are like a lot of other things that it is still good for. And I do agree with that statement like now, but I feel like also talked to a lot of people again, like there have just been like a lot of ups and downs where I've been like, do I actually like want to do this? Like, do I need this degree?
Mm-hmm.
So all that being said, I kind of like circled around, like had a really rough third year and applied to like the MPH programs, like not really knowing like at a point like whether I was going to go forward. But then it was like everything just kind of like fell into place like around the same time that like COVID happened, where like it just like was a really opportune time for me to like go on leave.
Yep.
So my current status is um, would have been a fourth year PhD student this year, but I'm on leave. So I'll be coming back in July as like a rising fourth year. Um, and I did my MPH at Hopkins this year, concentration in epidemiology and biostats. So I'm hoping it was pretty much like I kept like coming back to this idea of like thinking like, oh, like, should I have gone the public health route? But I think it's like just over time, I've kind of realized that like the interest that I have, like it can be an asset that I have like a wide array of interest
Mm,
versus like I feel like in like some people perceive it as kind of like a liability, like, oh, like you're not focused enough just on like this one
yeah.
thing. But I feel like it's like some of the things I'm interested in, like these aren't mutually exclusive areas, and I feel like it's like there are a lot of people like at Hopkins, like the advisor I've been working for, he does like a lot of like psychiatric genetics, like epidemiology research. It has connection, like it's connected to like the school of medicine, but also like the school, like in their like psychiatric and behavioral sciences, but is also affiliated with the school of public health and their mental health department. And there's also like the Lieber Brain Institute. So I feel like it's like they're like I don't know, sometimes like these like distinctions between like like what is neuroscience, like it's
Yeah.
kind of just depending on like how clinical or not clinical you are. Like I feel like it's like you can't I think it's like really difficult to say like neuroscience is not related to public health because it's like, well, if you're approaching it from a prevention standpoint and like a population level, then like
Mm,
there are ways that you can address certain research questions where it's like, yeah, like neuroscience is public health. I don't know.
right.
I feel like I was kind of all over the place with that and didn't really explain like my work well. But I think like what the main thing that I was thinking about was like in talking about kind of like from like the very beginning, like my undergrad, like going forward is like I don't regret the path that I'm on now. And it's really nice that I've been able to have both. Like for
Yeah.
some reason, I was just thinking like, okay, like you have to choose, like you're either going to like get a PhD in neuro or you're going to become like a public health professional or
Yeah.
like go into like public health academia and like you have to make this decision. And I'm like, actually, like there was nothing stopping me from like going back and like still getting the MPH, like, and
Yeah.
I think like I've been able to understand better how like those two um kind of like the crosstalk between the two and how like the two degrees like complement each other really well. Um, so I would say that like I definitely think like getting a PhD, it's like a very serious endeavor. It's like
Yeah.
not something that should be taken lightly. And I feel like way more people probably apply to it than should, just because they're
Mm,
like, oh, well, like this is just like, I feel like this is like something I should do, like whether it's because of like the type of undergrad school you went to, or you just like don't know what else to do. Like, yeah, I would just say like it's not like I think it can be beneficial for certain people to just like go out and get more working experience first, or just like
yeah.
have like more life experiences to really get a sense of like what questions you're really passionate about, or just like
Mm,
in general, like my undergrad advisor like told me once, because I feel like he's always been like really supportive of my work and like I still have a pretty good relationship with, like he told me in a phone call once when I was like really struggling during like my third year my PhD, like he basically said like he was like, Liz, just like follow your interest. He was like, like I didn't really have it in my mind that like I wanted to be a professor, but he was like, I went to grad school like I did things that were interesting to me. Like,
Yeah.
I wanted to address the questions that I like genuinely wanted the answers to. And he's like, yeah, I was just following my interest. And for me, like that happened to be an academic career, but like it didn't have to be.
Yeah.
So I've always felt like his name's Frank. His advice was really good, I think, because I'm like, yeah, like I feel like you're not going to be able to perform well or like put your most into something if it's not something that you have like a very genuine interest in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. You gave me so much there. And right, like you and I have talked about this, the idea that getting a PhD, a lot of people who are, excelling at it and going there is because they're really passionate about a certain question, right? And that's kind of a key idea to keep in mind for anybody who's thinking about going. But also I feel like there is this sense that, if you're not passionate about it or you're not sure what you're passionate about, that PhD can be like, the worst thing ever because now you're stuck in it, right? But what I love about your story is now like you've been able to see that, you're doing your PhD, you're really enjoying it, but then you're like, let me follow my interest and follow this thing that's always been in my head, which is the MPH. And now you're finding the way, even in disciplines like so disparate on the surface of like something as micro as neuroscience, and then something as macro as public health. You've been able to go from the PhD to the Master of Public Health and now coming back around, right? So I think that it's like simultaneously, you do want to be really passionate about your question, but you also don't have to have it figured out right when you get to your PhD. You kind of shown that, right? And I think that's encouraging for a lot of people as well, right? Even though you had to go through a lot of struggle to like find what do I really care about? What am I interested in? You're able to make something as micro as neuro and macro as public health kind of come together. I think that's inspiring and pretty cool.
Yeah. And I was like I was very fortunate that I was in the position where I felt like there were people in the department who like really supported me with me like changing labs midway through graduate school too and like doing this. Like at first, like I felt like the graduate school wasn't like they're not crazy about people like going away and like because like basically they want people to like finish on time and like move through the program like in a timely manner. So I felt like they weren't particularly happy about me like wanting to do this when I first proposed it, and it's almost like COVID like actually helped my case a lot. But that being said, I'm also like fortunate that like I was able to like find a new advisor who kind of like saw things in the same way that I did in terms of like these two things that I was doing, like having like a good synergy and how we could like tie everything together. And I think it's like also good because it's like you do have to be very passionate about like one particular thing. Like it is like more of a narrow focus. But that being said, like I think it's also important not to be too siloed in your thinking in terms of like I feel like sometimes like you don't want to have like blinders on, right? Like I feel like it's like I think it's been good for me like being in the public health program to just like have like a very good breadth so I can like make connections and see how things maybe like fit together in a way that like if I had like just stayed in neuroscience, like again, it's like I think it's good to have like some like crosstalk across discipline, just like the way that like you're thinking about things, that like you're not like just thinking about the problem from like this one like narrow perspective, that you can kind of like incorporate other ways of thinking about particular issues and questions.
Right. And so the public health, in a way, right, zooming out to that macro view has allowed you to see the other things that you're passionate about, right? And I think that's really cool. And would you say, going back to what you were adding earlier, would you say it's common for people to be able to go do something like what you've been doing? I know from the Princeton perspective, you can speak on that, but if somebody's going to a PhD at some other school, do you think that they would have a difficult time trying to go take a leave of absence or a gap year? What is that like?
I don't know. I think it really depends. I think on like also, I mean, there have been like other people in PNI, I think, who have been allowed to take leaves like for internships and things, like some of the more computational people who are like, I'm going to go work at Amazon for the summer or something like that. In terms of like going to do an MPH, I feel like what I did was actually like more uncommon. But I have like a lot of my friends from like my MPH cohort, like our class is actually like 50% physicians, like either MDs or like current medical students. And apparently, so like I feel like what I did isn't like the most common. It was just kind of like what made sense for me at the time, like more of a unique situation. But a lot of my MD friends are like, I know a lot of people in my program who just finished their third year of med school.
Mm-hmm.
And like, apparently that is a common thing to do for
Yep,
people
it
to do
is.
the MPH in between third and fourth year.
Yep.
So I think like that's more, but also like Christine Murphy, like the graduate dean at Princeton, like she had told me once that like I wasn't like the first person either. Like she
Yeah.
said, like they had like someone before like start their PhD, go away, get a JD in the middle, and then come back and finish the PhD. So it's not like far-fetched. Like other people have, like there have been like other people who have done things like that before. It's just like not the most commonplace.
Yeah. And what I'm wondering is, do you think that's not the most commonplace because on the one hand, people who go to, get a PhD are very like, they know that this is what they want to do?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you think it's that there's some pressure when you're in the PhD land, as we call it, right? To like, to stay focused on, to stay focused on that and feel kind of pressure and maybe like, doubts and insecurities of like all that stuff. And I want to ask you about grad student mental health as well, but what do you think is driving that idea that very few people go to do a PhD and, take a break in the middle? Because to me, it would seem like that would make some sense because it's like 7 years long, sometimes 6 years long.
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
I would feel like a gap year might make some sense because of the duration, but it's not common. And why do you think that is?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. So yeah, I think there's a little bit of pressure like on both ends. Like I think there is some self-imposed pressure, I think, based on like, again, like maybe other like most graduate students are just like so like highly focused and like, have that tunnel vision and like want to, push things out and produce and like get through their PhD so they can like the people who were like very fixated more on like academic careers, especially in terms of like if you're thinking about timelines, potentially with like certain grants, or if you're like, okay, like I want to like get through my PhD so I can like get through it in like 5 years, like move on to my postdoc, like kind of like move through like trying to like get that academic position sooner rather than later.
Make some money.
Yeah. So I think like there is, I mean, a lot of it is like, I just don't think people really think about alternatives. Like, I don't think people even really think it's like an option. Whereas I feel like, I don't know, for me, like, I feel like even though in the MPH, like, even though I've been working a lot and it's not like a break, like in that sense, but it's a break in that like, it is something different. Like, I feel like I get to use different parts of my brain or like think about different things. And like, for me, like, especially like I've just been in Maryland this whole time where I'm originally from. And it's just been like really nice, just like having a year away from Princeton and like breaking out of the orange bubble.
Sure.
And just like, yeah, having that year off. And now I feel like I'm like heading into like my dissertation work. Like I feel, again, like I've been working on other things, but I haven't been working on like what I was doing before. So I do feel like to some degree, like refreshed in that sense and like ready to tackle the dissertation. Whereas like, I think like a lot of people just get so burnt out and like, but it's just kind of like that, like constant, like, just like keep on pushing. And yeah, it's hard. I personally think like people, like, I do think like having the option to like take a year off or do something different, like is really beneficial. Yeah, I just don't think like many people even think it's an option. And I think like the institution does kind of frown upon it. Like, I think like I was able to pull it off, but I think they were kind of like, oh, like, seriously, or like, I don't know like how to describe it. Like, I feel like there is some like institutional pressure as well, in terms of them like, like they don't want to let people leave because then I think there's like this concern like, oh, well, like once you leave, like what are the odds that like you're actually going to come back? But like for me, like I'm just like the kind of person where I was like, if I say like I'm going to come back, like I'm going to come back. Like, if I say like I'm going to do something, I'm like, no, like I am serious about this. So yeah, I guess that's kind of, pressure from many parties.
And I think that's tough and sad to hear in some ways that like, a field like medicine, right, where obviously there's a lot of work to be done, just in general in America with mental health. It's getting better and everything. But in a field like medicine now, I think like 75% of Princeton undergrads take a gap year before going to med school, and just nationwide, it's like a huge shift. Like my mom went to med school, and she was very, very rare in that she took a gap year. It was not a thing that happened before. And I think it's because people are recognizing that before you pursue something like med school, you want to see some other things. You want to like experience the world and really reflect, like, is this what I want? But it seems to me that, you know, PhD is sometimes up to 7 years, right? Which is longer than med school and everything. And I just feel that for people to do their most effective work and to really pursue these questions that they're most passionate about, you know, giving them an opportunity to step away for a little bit and come back might be beneficial. But I hope that, you know, institutions moving forward might, you know, recognize that, because, right, like, and I don't know this, you know this better, but I've read some posts about just what it's like to be in grad school and how isolating it can be, because you're working on your own project, and it's a lot of like time, like with the blinders, like you said, working on your own thing. And I think
in the back scope room in the dark,
in the dark, no vitamin D,
just like isolated, and just sitting in a dark room by yourself.
Losing that connection is, you could have the most mentally healthy person, and then if they're in a bad environment, not saying all grad school is bad, but just if they can't talk to anybody and stuff, like that can be rough. So I don't know. I'm just hoping we could do more to support our grad students. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. There's also like, I feel like there are so many like different directions I could go with that, but it's actually like really interesting. So PNI, we had a guest
for the
speaker
listeners, can you explain what
month.
PNI is?
Oh yeah. So sorry, PNI stands for Princeton Neuroscience Institute. It's basically just our neuroscience department at Princeton it's basically just a department, but it's also like, it's formally like an institute. So that's what that stands for. But so our department hosted as a guest speaker last month, this guy, his name's Forrest Coleman, and I think he did both his undergrad and his PhD at Princeton. But he graduated from like what would have been the PNI program. I think it was like Mol Bio technically that he got his degree from, but graduated in 2010. And he like came back and like had a Zoom call with like the current grad students and like some of our admins, basically talking about like his like how, and like I think he like came forward and contacted the department rather than vice versa, about like his struggles with clinical depression, like while a PhD student at Princeton. And yeah, I think he like came to us and was like, I think this is a really important issue to talk about, which is cool. But I felt like some of the points that he made were really interesting as he told his story, just about like some of the things that he struggled with. Like he like talked a lot about how he like, when he like recognized that he really needed help, how like in therapy, he learned how to focus more on like externalizing things versus like internalizing. Like instead of being like, oh, like I worked so hard on like all these experiments and like my experiments failed, like my project failed, that means like I'm a failure. Like being able to like externalize and be like, no, like I did everything right. It's just like sometimes in science is hard and sometimes things don't work out. Like this is not a reflection on like my self-worth, or like the project failing does not make me a failure. And like how he was like in a lot of ways how he was able to kind of like shift his mindset to like more of that like externalization. And I thought that was really cool and valuable. And just how he was able to talk about like things that he was able to do to like make his experience more positive, like once he identified that he was like really struggling, and basically, you know, that this was like almost I read Bravey recently by Alexi Pappas, which is kind of going in a different direction.
Go for it.
But she competed in the 2016 Olympics in Rio, in the 10K. Like she like ran for Dartmouth, but has like dual citizenship with Greece. Anyway, she just put out a book this year in January, basically where she like, it's not just a book about women's running. Like she talks a lot about like her struggles with like depression and like suicidality, and how she just like after she competed at the Olympics just had like took this like nosedive, and like a lot of it she talks a lot about basically like, the focus of the book is mental health. But she also like talks a lot about, I don't know, just like I think like a lot of the points she made were like very relatable about like, even though like she'd like, you know, was like performing at such a high stage and like, you know, is someone who was like on the surface like excelling in like their craft and like what they were doing, just kind of like the hard work that like she had to put in to kind of like combat some of those feelings of like worthlessness or like self-loathing, which it's like, it's
Yeah.
interesting. I feel like it's like, especially, not to say like I feel like grad school is hard everywhere, but I feel like it's
Right.
also like at Princeton, like you're always also like making comparisons, even if like consciously, like even if like outwardly like you don't think you are. I feel like you're always kind of like implicitly thinking like, oh
Yeah.
well, like this person is doing this, and like, am I not working hard enough, or like blah blah blah, blah, or like, it's hard not to like play the comparison game and like be also like thinking about that and like feeling bad about things. So
Yeah.
it's definitely like always something. And like, I feel like we do have a lot of resources, but it's also, the state of mental health in grad school is not great.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that like our department is doing things to try to like bring more recognition to it.
Right.
And in addition to like having speakers and like acknowledging that it's an issue, it's like, okay, well, like what can we like what actionable steps can we take to like do something about it, I think is like the next step. So
Yeah.
I feel like it's
No.
good. It's good that it's not like, oh yeah, like everyone's great here. Like everything's awesome all the time. I think
Yeah.
grad school is hard for a lot of people.
I love all those thoughts, and right, what the PhD person was saying about externalizing things, right? In psych, we talk about trying not to you know uh, externalize like all your. So you want to externalize like some of your failures sometimes, and not like I'm getting stuck trying to like explain this. Basically, right? You don't want to always be internalizing failures like you were talking about. And so just work. I think it's attribution theory, like what you attribute internally versus externally, and trying to stay level with that. So I think that's really interesting. And then also what you're talking about, the Olympian, I feel like comes back full circle to some of the things we're talking about with, stepping out of the rat race and like doing your MPH this year. And then for me, on my gap year, like I think I was talking about this earlier with somebody, this idea that I think when I was a bit more immature, and I'm still pretty immature, I'm working on it, right? But when I
Same.
was, right? But
All of us.
like a few years ago or so, I felt like I was always kind of chasing those like big days in life, like those celebrations, or like winning a championship, or getting into Princeton, or doing these things, like chasing those big days, when in reality, so much of life is those like boring days, or those mundane days where there's not as much going on, right? And I think, obviously I've never been an Olympian, but I can resonate with being an Olympian in that sense, right? Where if you're an Olympian, I can imagine that you're chasing that high so much of like hopefully winning a gold medal, right? And you're working like every day towards that. And then even if you do get it, I can imagine how difficult it might be afterwards when you're not looking forward to that anymore.
It's kind of like, okay, like, well, what's
like,
next? Like, how do I keep like, it's like you're constantly like setting the bar higher and higher.
Yeah.
And like, I think like with like Alexi's story too, like a big part of it that she like talks about in the book is also like her mom died by suicide when she was 4 years old. So I think like a lot of it is like also her kind of like realizing the parallels between like her and her mom, and also like just like that. I think she like talks a little bit about like, because of like that early life experience that she had, like so much of her, like she always kind of felt like she had to prove to herself that she mattered, because I think it's like part of her felt like, oh well, like if I had mattered more, like my mom wouldn't have left, which is like obviously like, like you can't think about things that way, and that's like not true. But I think she also like that, and I think like, I don't know, like I've definitely like felt that way before about things.
sure.
Like I feel like I still
Me
like
too.
base a lot of like the way that I think about myself or like self-worth based on like external validation, like about like, oh, like the external like accolades or like this or that, or like, like I need to like even like when I was applying to PhD programs, like there were like a couple of schools like closer to like DC that I like wanted to apply for. And I was like working with this professor who was like a neurobiology professor at Penn, who's a SWAT alum, was kind of like giving me advice. And he literally told me like to take 2 of those schools off my list because they were like beneath me. So I was just like, okay, like was basically like, well, like, don't you want to be great? And like, of course, like me, like, I'm just like, yeah, like that's what I'm all about. But like, Yeah, but also like at the same time, like there have been so many times where like a couple of like my male teammates, like on my post-collegiate team, for example, like are doing their PhDs at Maryland, which is like, like a great school. And
Yeah.
like, and part of me is just like, damn, like if I had applied there, like I wouldn't have had to have moved. And like I could have had like, maybe I would have had more social support. Like it wouldn't have been like all these major changes at once, which like I feel like now it's like, I feel like Princeton feels like more of a home to me. Like I've lived there long enough that like I have friends, like there are like certain things that are like nice and familiar that I do like really like about it. But I think it was like at first too, like it was like I knew like one person who was there,
Yeah.
which was like it's always nice just like knowing like someone. But I knew literally one person, didn't really like know anyone in New Jersey or like have like a team or anything. It was just kind of like I didn't want to like give up my opportunity, to like I was like, okay, like you got in here, like, they think that like you deserve this, like you shouldn't like hold yourself back or like
Yeah.
not take your opportunity to go to Princeton because of like, oh, like, well, maybe my social life would be better in DC. I
Yeah.
don't know. But yeah, it's also something I've like gone back. I just like go back and forth with it all the time. And now I'm like, no, like you need to finish this degree.
Right.
But it's something I've like thought about a lot. And I'm like, well, it's not like purely, I don't know, in terms of like always wanting to like do things that like are impressive to people. Cause I'm like, well, then that's
Yes.
like not really it. It's more
Mm,
like I want it for myself, or it's like
mm,
I don't want to feel like I'm like holding myself back from like what I'm capable of. But at the same
yeah.
time, like sometimes like I feel like it has really like impacted my decisions, like that example of like
Yes.
this professor being like, well, don't you like want to be the best? Like, like why would you like not go here? Um, Yes.
So
So
it's, I mean, this is so interesting, right? And
part of me is just like, oh yeah, like I don't put as much value on those like external validation things as much as I used to, but then like sometimes I'm like, oh no, I totally do.
right, right.
So
And
it's hard.
absolutely so hard. Thank you for sharing that because obviously it resonates with me a lot. And I think what you were saying about that runner, right? And the power of narrative. So like for her, the runner's narrative was like, I wasn't enough for my mom and whatnot. And I think all of us carry these narratives around inside of us about the world. You
Mhm.
know what I mean? And I think it's because it makes the world easier to navigate. Like it's very scary and difficult to navigate the world without any of these narratives because if you think about it, like so much of our identity is built on these things. Like I'm a good student, or I'm a good
Mhm.
father, or I'm a good basketball player or track runner, etc. And so like I feel like it's almost impossible to live without narratives, but I feel that at the end of the day, that's something we should strive for because so many times these narratives, like we build up these things in our minds about who we are. And like when things shatter those narratives, then we're just kind of broken. You know what I mean? And
Mhm.
I think like as an example, I've tried so hard not to build narratives, but when I got accepted to Princeton, always there's going to be some narrative in my mind that I'm like really good at this, at what I do,
Mhm.
and I'm a good student. You know what I mean? And I should strive to go to like the best possible medical school. And like frankly, I didn't get into the number one, number two, number three medical schools and all
Yeah, and
that.
also
And it's
disclosure, I was gonna say, go circling back to PhD
yeah,
programs. I think I told you like when you were like
right, right,
stressing about like the med school thing and everything. Like I actually like for my PhD, like I applied to 7 schools. I only got 2 interviews.
right.
And that was like really, I mean, granted, like I did apply to like pretty like the PhD programs I applied to were all pretty high level. Cause again, I had like this guy who was like my mentor being like,
In your
no,
ear,
like you
yeah,
should only like apply to like Harvard and like that kind of attitude. But that being said, like that was like I don't know, it's difficult like when you're someone who like again like you have this identity of like I'm like
yes.
the good student, and then it's like when you're faced with like that reality of like getting all these rejections, like like not even like I didn't even get interviews to like 5 out of my 7 schools, and I was like freaking out that I was like I'm not going to get in anywhere like which is like not like, and not like all the schools that I applied to were like Harvard, Hopkins. Like there were a couple where like I was like, oh yeah, I feel like this is like pretty secure where
Yeah,
like
yeah,
I think I'll get it like an offer here. And they didn't want to interview me. And I was
yeah.
like, which sounds like I don't want that to come across as like super cocky, but
No,
it was
no.
more like just based on like what I knew about the program. I was like, oh, like, yeah, like I think this is like very reasonable. And then, yeah, it's hard like when you have like these certain like identities and then like coming up against that rejection or thinking like, yeah, like first coming to Princeton, being like, my whole life, like I thought I was smart, but now I realize I'm dumb. And like, who am
Yeah.
I? Yeah, I don't know. It's like, yeah, it's hard because like you can feel like when you feel like you're not fulfilling like that particular identity, then like it's easy, like you were saying, like to feel so lost. And I feel like, yeah, like I feel like that has very strong implications for mental health as well. Like that was like my first year of college.
Yeah.
Before I transferred, which I like won't get into that story, but yeah, it was kind of like I felt like the only thing I like really had that like still defined me like was my academic
Yep.
success. Like I was
Yep.
like, okay, I was like, I felt like I was like stripped of everything except that. And I was like, okay, this is like the one thing I have to cling to still feel like I have value or that like I'm
Mm.
whole, which sounds like really sad.
No, it's very relatable. Trust me. I'm
But it's
sure people
also
can
like,
relate.
yeah, it's like that first year when like when I found out like I couldn't walk on and like I didn't run my first year, like that was just like I didn't realize how much it was gonna affect me like
Yeah.
beforehand. Like I think I was like, oh, like whatever, like if I can't, then I'll just like find something else to do. And yeah, I think it was just kind of like that whole experience of like feeling like you like wrap yourself up so much in like these identities and then
Yeah.
having to like when you feel like you don't have that anymore, you're just like, who am I? You know?
Right. And I think I've heard somebody phrase it in this way, which is kind of a hard pill to swallow, but I don't think is wrong at all. It's like there's really not much difference between thinking you're the worst in the world and you're thinking that you're the best in the world at something,
Mhm.
right? It's like narcissism with two different faces, essentially. And so, you
Mhm.
know, they're both kind of toxic, right? When you're thinking you're the worst in the world, that's just a self-defeating mindset. But then when you're thinking you're the best in the world, it just leaves yourself vulnerable to having those identities and all those things that you wrap yourself in kind of
Mhm.
shatter when inevitably you fail at something, right? And because nobody is going through life without failing at things. So I just think that's important to keep in mind and trying to live without those identities, but it's not easy. It's not easy at all. Because like, you want to, I feel like you want to be able to live your life in a way that there's nothing that you value so much or shroud yourself in so much that it can break you if it doesn't work out, right? And so
Mhm.
I don't know. It's just trying to evaluate prestige appropriately, like not too much, but not too little. Because I remember you saying like, if I'm accepted here, then I should go, right? They think I am deserving of that, and I shouldn't turn it down in terms of fear and everything. But so it's not like you should never value prestige, but
Mhm.
it's about when you're valuing it too much. So it's just all very interesting
Right.
thoughts.
It's also kind of like how you like conceptualize yourself. This is like not to get like too personal, but also in terms
I
of
love it.
like it's
I
more
love it.
like thinking about also like just because like you're not a good fit for something doesn't mean like you are not worthy or like
Mm,
like sometimes it's more about like compatibility or like fit for something but it's not like a testament of like better or worse per
yes.
se like whether that's like getting accepted into like a certain like academic or professional program or if it's like personal relationships because yeah I feel like I tend to like fall into this kind of like very polarized type of thinking like I'm the best like no like I'm the worst like I feel like I like that kind of thinking is like very like me or like the way that I sometimes like communicate like it's like thinking in absolutist terms like
Mm,
oh like things like never go my way or like this always happens like kind of
yeah.
like that those like using
It's a
that kind of like
narrative.
extreme yeah like
It's
that
a narrative in
extremist
your mind.
language yeah and I also like it's actually interesting for like a certain relationship that I was in a few years ago I like had a therapist saying like like you can kind of tell yourself like I think I'm great and like I bring all this to the table and like what does this person see in like this other person that they think is better than me or like thinking about like things in terms of like this person is better like I'm
Mm,
better like you can't really like think about people that way like she was kind of
yeah.
like you have to think more about like she kind of like introduced this idea to me about how she's like you need to accept that like you're not everyone's perfect package and you have to like learn to be okay with that and I was like
Mm,
ooh like you're so right
okay. Okay.
like which like it wasn't like intended to like insult or like, I mean, I guess it was intended to like challenge me like a little bit, like
Yeah.
challenge that like type of thinking. But I was like, no, she's right. Like, she's not trying to like put me down or be like, oh yeah, like you're not all that, like, but is more just trying to like, I think it's more like approaching the world in a realistic way in which like you're not sabotaging yourself by
Yes.
like the way that you're able to like frame things or think about the world. Like,
Yeah.
this isn't because I'm like unworthy or like, yeah, not enough, essentially. It's more kind
Yeah.
of like, again, like changing the narrative about like the way that you think about like your relationships with people or things. So
Yeah.
I don't
No,
know.
yeah.
Food for thought.
No, I
Didn't think
love it.
we'd go here, but it's mixed it up with ML.
It's messed it up. No,
We
man,
can talk
I'm
about
loving this.
anything.
We can. Who knows if anybody's listening? And if they are, I think they're gaining some inspiration
Yeah,
from
I'm like,
this.
do you think we actually have listeners?
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. But yeah, so I'm trying to gather like what I was gonna say there. And because I love it all. I really resonate with it. And yeah, I think I'll speak from my experience, right? Again, when I was more immature, like I'm not immature now, but
Yeah, it's like
back in the
back
days,
before I was so mature.
like I reached maturity. But I feel like, and I don't think I'm the only one in this way, that we all kind of have this tendency and we have to take work to grow out of it. But just that you feel like your life is a movie and you're the star player and you're sort of
Yeah, like I'm the main character.
everybody's eyes are on me and I'm the most important thing. And again, that's like a positive narcissism thing, right? It's like you're looking at yourself like too positively, like people care that much. And I think again, like going to Princeton is a great thing. I'm super like it's probably one of the biggest privileges I've ever had, but also recognizing that yes, I was accepted is extremely selective, but there's also like 1,500 people each year who are selected. It's like you're not the only person to ever go to Princeton or like ever achieve whatever great thing that you've achieved. Like trying to not look at yourself as the only person to go through things in the world, whether positive or negative, and just recognize that we're all part of this like human condition where, everybody's special just in their own way. And that sounds very wishy-washy. I'm not trying to sound wishy-washy, but like we all have things to bring to the table. And just because like going to Princeton is a great thing, but it doesn't mean that you're any better than somebody else who has another talent that doesn't have a name attached to it or something like that. You know what I mean? And so that's something that I've been trying to work through and actively, like happiness, I feel like, and mental health takes work and active restructuring of your brain, plasticity.
Yeah,
it's
all synapses.
Right?
It's all remodeling synapses. It is though.
You know what I mean? I don't know if any of that was relatable, but just stuff I've been thinking about, especially on this gap year.
Yeah, it's also like interesting when you think about that in terms of, I think like with me, I also react to it in different, and by it, I mean, like kind of like thinking about like, where do I like fit in like this like hierarchy of people or like this thing or like whatever. I think it's like, I react differently in like different context. So like to try to explain what I'm trying to say is like, for example, like with my running, like I like the way I feel about that is I'm like, I don't want to like join a team and be like the fastest person. Like I'm like, I want to be the worst. Like I want to be like the slowest person because I feel like athletically, I feel like it's motivating to be like, I'm with these people who are like more talented than me or like currently better. Like I find that like very motivating to be like, okay, like this is what I want to work up to. I want to be able to like hang with these people and like improve. And like, like I see it as kind of like a goal to strive for sort of. And I find that like very motivating in that context. But then sometimes like I'm trying to think of like an example, like not so much like in academia, but I'm like trying to think of an example where like I feel like it's really like the opposite. Maybe like academia,
I know what
sure,
you mean,
why
though.
not?
I know what
but
you
just
mean,
in terms of like our department, for example, like there were some people in my cohort who were like true like superstars, like I would go to say like I think like they're brilliant, like yeah, just in terms of like some of the things that they can do or things that they know. Like me coming in like my first year and being like, oh well, like how did this one get in? Yeah, like kind of like in that, but like in that context, I feel like it's like it can feel very self-defeating being like, wow, like I'm used to like being like, again, like the good student, and then like that kind of like comparison. Like whereas in the running context, I feel like it's like very positive, where it's like motivating. Like I want
Wow.
to like be not like be bad, but like, like be at the bottom and like work my way up, versus like in that context, it's like I'm at the bottom and like this just really sucks and like
Yeah.
feels miserable to like feel like I'm not like achieving what, or I'm coming in and like I'm not as good as, this person at like this particular thing or whatever. So yeah, it's interesting because I feel like it's like in those different environments, like
Mm.
in one context, like I find it very motivating. In another, it can be like very discouraging.
And it's crazy, right? Because
I don't
all
know.
the way going back to the beginning, right? We talked about how we had similarities with, almost going to Hopkins and whatnot. Because I feel the same way about like my high school basketball experience. So I could have, went somewhere and not won as many games and, been the star player. But I wasn't the star player in my high school team, but we were an amazing team and I learned so much from it. And I truly feel that like maybe I would have had more points attached to my name at another school, but I feel like I was a better basketball player
Mhm.
because I went to my high school where I surrounded myself with better players than me. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think that's
And
also,
it's yeah.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go
I
ahead.
was just
Go
going to
ahead.
say, I think it's like, again, like that mentor who said to me, like, those
Yeah,
places are beneath you. Like, I think like it was very well intentioned, because I think he was trying to say, like, you want to be at a place, again, like where there are people who are
challenge,
like
growth.
better than you that will like really like, yeah, like build you up, and like you'll learn more and like overall be better for having thrown yourself, like being like a small fish in a big pond as opposed to like
Right,
a big
right.
fish in a small pond, so it's kind of the same idea. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, not at all. And I love it. And it's just I had the same experience. Like I went to Princeton, got blasted freshman year. I was like, who am I? Like I'm not playing basketball at Princeton and my grades suck. You know what I mean? So
Mhm.
like I also had that loss of identity problem. And I just, yeah, I think why is it that I was able to look at that challenge more positively in the basketball arena and not so much academically? I don't know if it's because like my professional career depended on my grades and whatever, but um, yeah, I don't know. I think I've heard somebody talk about, you know, looking at life, not trying to be comfortable or like happy, like on the beach eating grapes all the time, you know what I mean? Because that gets boring after a
Yeah.
while, right? And finding like meaning in struggle and finding
Mhm.
that as like something to strive for and to not be too comfortable all the time. You know what I mean? But then we go back, we talk about like you don't need to wrap your life up in these prestige things of like going to the hardest place and
Yeah.
everything. So
It's
it's
like
all balance.
Man's Search for Meaning by
Viktor
Viktor
Frankl.
Frankl.
Yes,
Although
sir.
that's like a more of an extreme because he's
Yeah.
a Holocaust survivor,
And
which
we're
is
like,
like
we've
not
never
us
faced
going to
anything like
like
that.
this privileged Ivy League institution.
Right, right.
It's like, yeah, basically like a concentration camp survivor
Right.
over here. It's not
Disclaimer,
really the
listeners,
same. But
please don't think that's the same. It's not the same. Please don't think that. But
anyway, but some
man,
good lessons that came out of that
yeah,
book.
man, I feel like I think we're getting closer to time. We have a few
I
minutes left,
know
but
the
I'm just
time
like,
just flew and we talked about things that we were not planning on talking about,
right, right.
but it's
And so,
cool.
I don't want to throw on the ethics of animal research with 7 minutes to go or six
Yeah.
minutes to go. We can maybe save that for a second pod because I think that's a really interesting topic, and I want to part two. I want to talk about that with you, but I guess two brief things, right? In the closing minutes here, we talked a little bit about the public health degree plus your neuroscience, and so on that front, um, what do you think your future looks like in terms of maybe what you want to work in now that you have this experience with the public health degree? Like how do you if you have any idea, you don't have to, how you want to merge those two things? Two, would you recommend that I would go into that and maybe get that degree in med school? And like what should I think about when I'm thinking about trying to do it or not do it? What's the criteria that I should think about? What
Yeah. So
self-reflection should I do? You know what I
sure.
mean?
So I guess I'll tackle the first one
Yeah.
to begin. I think with my situation is I did kind of resolve to finish my PhD with
Mm-hmm.
like having the MPH. just to reiterate from before, like my concentration was in epi and biostats, but I've also like been able to get a couple of certificates. Like I discovered that I'm really interested in environmental health, and am getting a certificate in that, as well as like humane sciences and toxicology policy, which kind of me being interested again in like animal research and bioethics pertaining to that. Yeah, I actually like ended up like doing a little bit of toxicology type work
Okay.
this year, which I've like haven't studied before. So yeah, I feel like my interests are like pretty varied. Like did a little bit of policy work this year as well. So kind of what I'm currently thinking about is I haven't completely ruled like postdocs in public health off the table. Like I think it's probably like not super likely, but I don't want to say never. I'm thinking like I'm leaning more towards regulatory science, I think is a really good fit for me. So like basically think about like what the FDA does.
Okay.
Like I've been on the ICOOC at Princeton, which is basically ICOOC, it stands for Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. So it's pretty much like any institution that does research has an ICOOC, which is a committee that pretty much like reviews protocols and ensures like the humane and appropriate use of animals in biomedical research.
Hmm.
So I've been on the ICOOC for 2 years, and I actually feel like that is probably, I feel like honestly, like that's the work that I feel like I do the best, like in
I
terms of
love
like
it.
my iCook reviews. I think it like comes from a place of, I care a lot about the animals. I feel pretty strongly about how those animals are being used and like what's permissible and like not permissible, and like how people, how we think about like harm benefit, like weighing
Mm,
those things and making decisions about like what we perceive to be ethical in research. And I'm taking a like a really interesting class right now about like animals and research, like the law and policy
can't
behind
wait to
that.
ask you about this. Yeah.
Which I
Another
could talk
pod.
more about, but I'm like, I don't want to
Yeah.
get too much into it. But because that is like a very strong interest of mine, I think like that does translate really well into like regulatory science, because it's essentially like what the FDA does is basically just like reviewing like drugs and
Yeah.
medical devices and things to like ensure that they're safe for people to use. And I feel like that's like very much in line with the things that I'm interested in. Also interested in applying to the AAAS fellowship, which is basically like you can get put in like a legislative or executive branch fellowship, or like with like some like with like the Department of Health and Human Services, like they place people at NIH and like the FDA and things. But that's like something I'm seriously thinking about, like maybe like moving more into the policy sphere.
Yeah.
um, and like I actually did get like had like a really good conversation with this Hopkins alum who works in like environmental health consulting in Boston.
Mm,
So TBD, I don't know if I would work for this exact company, but the kind of things that she was describing to me, I felt like really resonated. So yeah, kind of like a mix of
yeah.
like policy, health consulting, regulatory. Like I think that's where like I fit in a little bit better. Pivoting to what I would recommend for the MPH, yeah, I would say like I said, like my program is 50% MDs, and like again, like current med students. And I
Hmm.
think like a lot of them feel like it's been really valuable. Like I think it's, I don't, again, like I haven't been to med school, like I'm not a doctor, so I don't know like exactly what's covered in medicine. But I think it's like it's always good to kind of like, I think like what I didn't realize at first, like before I knew what public health really was, like it's almost kind of like you can think about like public health and medicine being like two sides of a coin, where it's kind of like
Mm,
medicine is more about treatment. I think like the key difference is like medicine is about treatment versus public health is often more about prevention. And medicine is at the individual patient level versus public health is more of a population level
got it.
focus.
Got it.
So those are how like the two are different. But like needless to say, like a lot of doctors have MPHs. I think like with like epidemiology, I think it's good to have like the
I think it's
quantitative
so
skills,
cool. Yeah.
to be able to like understand statistics and like be able to, because it's like basically you need good epidemiology, like with COVID, for example. Like
Yeah.
it's like you realize how important it is to have like good predictive, both like risk factor models, but also like trying to like identify like causal factors and like predictive models,
Hmm.
basically because it's like we need to make policies based, like basically you need data to do anything, to like
Right.
inform your models, to like make decisions about like how to keep people safe, how to like prevent like the greatest number of people from like ending up in the ICU, like with
Hmm.
COVID. You just kind of like realize like how important like those like model building skills are.
Yeah.
um And yeah, even if like you don't go into epi, I mean, I think like there are a lot of different, like with like the policy realm, what I'm interested in with like the AAAS fellowship, I mean, I think like our government could definitely benefit by having more people with scientific expertise, like helping to make either again like legislative decisions or
Agreed.
informing like the executive branch. Like I think it's just more important to like have more people with that, like not to like kind of like keep all of that knowledge in these silos again, kind of like I feel like it's kind of like, I think it's important to have scientists like not only in your academic institutions doing research, but like also to have them like out in other professions, because it's like, I think it's good to kind of like spread the wealth and like have people with like those scientific critical thinking
Love
skills,
that.
like working in these other areas, because it's just kind of like, I think like building diversity too, like just kind of like
Yes.
having like more diverse thinking contributing to like people just doing things better, which I feel
Right.
like I wish I had said that in a more eloquent way.
No.
But I think, yeah, I think it's basically, it's good to have scientists doing other things that are not just like purely academic research.
Right.
Anyway, but for the context of like, I mean, you can also like just have an MD and not have an MPH and still do those things and it's fine. So it's like, yeah, it's kind of hard to say. I mean, I feel like you could probably still do a lot with like an MD, like MSLs, like you could have like a medical degree and like like go into consulting,
Hmm.
or like I'm trying to think of like other examples. You can like, you don't even need a PhD. Like there are like a lot of PIs at the NIH who are MDs who like they're not MD PhDs, like they never had like formal training in doing research, but they're just like medical doctors and they're like, I
Yeah.
want to do research now. So I feel like there's like not, I don't know if an MPH is ever like required. That would be like the
Yeah.
argument against doing it. But like for
Yeah.
me, like I've just personally like really enjoyed thinking about a lot of different things. And
Yeah.
it's like, I think I've had like a really good breadth of coursework. Like I've been able to like do a little, like get some, and it's really interesting. Like for me, I think it's like from being a neuroscientist, like I tend to think about things from like this more like scientific or like quantitative perspective. And then it's like when I'm thinking about like I'm taking like a health advocacy class this term, or like my practicum was like policy work, trying to like work for like the Maryland General Assembly,
Hmm.
trying to like shape legislation relating to like mental health support for like students in the COVID-19 context. And
Boom.
like for that, like it's almost like I feel like I'm like, okay, like time to put your policy thinking cap on. Like it's almost like it's weird. Like I feel like it's like I just have to kind of like make this shift, and like my policy brain is like different from like the way I think about science. So
Okay.
yeah, I don't really know. It's like it just like it's a different way of thinking, and I feel like I kind of like that sometimes though, like not, yeah, just being able to like think about different things and like use different skills rather than just like doing the same thing all the time. I guess
Right.
that's like just important generally for being satisfied in your career, probably,
Great point.
is if you're bored, you're probably not going to be doing your best work.
Great point. That's super helpful for me, ma'am, because I had this like real
I'm like,
interest
was
in.
it? I don't know.
No, it was because I
But
had this real interest in like statistics and
mhm,
under like the science of why, you know what I mean? And
mhm,
science of causation and all those things are very interesting to me. And I think I can get plenty of that. We'll see how I feel in med school after
yeah,
like years and years of school. But you know,
yeah, it's so
I'm thinking
much.
about that stuff. It's interesting. Thank you for sharing that perspective. And then as we wrap up here, I like to end the episodes of what has been some sort of, you know, anything, activity, thing, book, movie, anything that's brought you joy in quarantine, or it could be something new that you found, or maybe it's just running. You're doing more running if you are. But what is, what's been more of your hobby or your fun thing that you're tapping into?
Yeah. I mean, I could say guinea pigs because,
Guinea
but everyone like
pigs.
already knows that about me. Yeah, crazy rodent lady. But yeah, I would say like this is kind of boring, but really just like it's been nice, like me being back here, just being able to like run with a lot of people and like connect. Like surprisingly, like during COVID, I like told one of my friends from college recently, I was like, yeah, I've weirdly made a lot of friends this year, like somehow.
Mm,
And yeah, like it's just been fun. Like I've made a lot of new friends, like teammates. Um, Yeah, I think it's like, it's interesting because I think like some people have like, people tend to go like one way or the other. Like they're like, like working out really hard has just been like so helpful for me like during quarantine, versus some people are like, oh, like I just don't have like the mental capacity to like
Yeah.
put into training right now. So it's kind of like, I feel like it can go either way. But I feel like for me, like it's just like, it's felt like a really good outlet. It's also like working from home. Like, yeah, I feel like running is the best part of my day.
Love
And
it.
just I've made a lot of new friends this year and it's been really fun. So I
Man,
joke,
I'm
I'm like,
so
all
happy
we
to hear
do is hang out at this high school,
that.
which like it's very simple, but like yeah, it's provided like a lot of structure. Like I love seeing everyone. I made a lot of friends. It's kind of a boring answer, but
It's really not boring. I'm so happy to hear that, man, because you've been working really hard and going through a lot. And so I just want to see you thriving and enjoying life. And it sounds
thanks.
like you are. I know obviously the MPH is tough and always gonna be some difficulties, but I'm really glad to hear
Yeah.
you're doing well. That's awesome.
Yeah. Thanks.
That's
Thanks for
awesome.
having me.
Well, yeah, I think we're at time. I have no idea how long exactly this is, but I think we're at time. Ma'am, again, thank you for coming on. It's wonderful hearing your perspective, and we will have you back on for episode 2 about
Part
animal ethics
2.
and the
Yeah.
guinea pigs and the rodents and everything. So
And
it'll be great.
everything we thought we might talk about and then ran out of
Yeah.
time for.
Well,
But it's
thank you
fine.
again, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Always a good time.
You know it.
Maybe I'll create a spin-off podcast called Mixed Up with LT.
Go for it. Go for it. I'm all for it. All right. Thank you,
All
ma'am.
right. Bye,
To the
everyone.
listeners, peace.
If we have listeners.